use. I'm going to talk about setting up your camera. I have a section called Your Presence, Your Vibe, sort of reading the street, using light, very important part of photography. Also, when to press the shutter, the decisive moment, if you will. And then whether you use black and white or color, and finishing off with what I call sort of a short discussion on legal and moral issues regarding street and travel photography. I will take breaks at each of these areas, each of these sections, for questions if you have questions. That way we keep the questions sort of germane to what has just been talked about, and you can either click on your mic. I'd ask to keep yourself muted, but then click on the mic to ask a question, or you can type it out in the chat. I'll try to monitor the chat as well. So this is my contact information. I run a Cold Snap Photography. Cold Snap Photography has been around for about 30 years. And as Tony mentioned, I do workshops. I do a number of workshops all over the US and Mexico and up into Canada. You can reach me at john@coldsnapphotography.com if you have any follow-up questions that are specific to the talk or photography. You can also follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and you can just look me up, John Gregor, on either of those platforms. This is my studio in Minnesota. This is about what it looks like right now. They've been getting quite a bit of snow up there this winter, and they've been getting hammered pretty good. But I have a studio up there. If you're up in the North Country, July 30th, I have my annual barbecue where I kind of open the doors, and it's a casual open house, and we fix some great barbecue, and you're all welcome to show up. That's a Sunday afternoon, July 30th. I do a number of workshops, as I mentioned, up in northern Minnesota, as well as down in Utah, the West Coast, and in Canada and Mexico. A lot of the workshops that I do include printmaking, where you're working in the field and then working with the image files and printing them out. This particular workshop that the photo is of was a night skies workshop. And yes, we saw the northern lights. We actually had a wonderful display of northern lights during that workshop. So I'm going to talk about the equipment that I use. I am photographing with Fuji these days. XT, actually I use the XT3, XT4. I have a GFX system as well. I don't use that a whole lot for travel and street. I just spent 5.5 months down in Mexico, and I took the XT3 and 4 system because they're a little bit lighter. The GFX gets a little big and a little heavy for traveling a whole lot, so I didn't take that down to Mexico. And then for a lot of street stuff, I have these smaller Fuji cameras, which I really love. They're a fixed lens, fixed focal length lens with a 28 and 35 millimeter. And what I like about these cameras is they're so small and compact. And that's another reason why I don't use the GFX. It's such a large, imposing camera. You put a lens on there and it's a behemoth, where these things are really small. That X70 is pocket size. It's not even the size of a pack of cigarettes. It's very small, slips in and out of your pocket really easily. Also, if you use one of my favorites these days, the favorite system is here. I'll just grab it real quick. Sorry about that. Is the XT4 stripped down without the battery pack. And I've been using a couple aftermarket lenses on these Fujis. This is a Voigtlander, and it's a 1.2 f1.2, which is great for street stuff, especially when in the low light situations. It's really fast and very, very bright. It's a manual focus, which is a little tricky, but works great. And then I also have a Zeiss 12 millimeter, a little wider. It's not quite as fast as a 2.8, but it's still fairly fast. So having fast glass is handy for street stuff because a lot of this stuff takes place in low light after the sun goes down. That's when a lot of action starts happening for street. So you want to have lenses that are pretty quick. So I'm going to talk about setting up your camera, how to set up the camera, sort of prepare yourself as you go out to shoot street stuff. Being prepared for street photography is a large part of it. The last thing you want to do is sit and fumble around with the camera while you have a photographic situation. You want to have that camera's setting set, and you're not thinking about that. You're thinking about far more important things, which is the relationship to the subject and your composition. So how I set my camera up is I use aperture priority so that I'm selecting the aperture, it's selecting the shutter speed. The thing I love about the Fuji's is it has the little dial on the top, which is really easily, quickly changed for under and over exposure. I use autofocus on the single shot, single autofocus, because a lot of times I'm focusing one place and then readjusting that for the composition. So I use a single shot on the autofocus. If I'm using an autofocus lens, as I said, that Voigtlander lens is a manual focus, so I manually focus that. The ISO I leave in manual, and I set according to the situation that I am. And then my drive setting is a continuous low because I like to have the ability to take numerous shots. So I might just lay on the shutter and go boom, 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 particularly in low light situations. And when you're hand holding, the in-camera in body stabilization or the lens image stabilization these days with cameras is fantastic. I love it for street use, but even still, you want to keep the camera as steady as possible. And by going continuous drive low, you can lay on the shutter. And that is, generally speaking, where you're going to get any movement or motion with the camera is when you're pushing that shutter button. You're going to jiggle the camera a little bit. Well, if you're on continuous low, you can just hold it down and you shoot off about 3 shots. Boom, boom, boom. And the second or third one is probably going to be sharper than the first one because you may have moved the camera slightly when you press that button. So the aperture I like to keep as wide as possible, and that means f2.0 or even wider. If I'm using that 1.2 lens, I might go as wide open as 1.2 to f16. I know that's quite a range, but I select as wide as possible for what I need for the situation. So there are situations occasionally where you've got plenty of light and you want more depth of field where you're stopping down. But generally speaking, when I'm thinking in terms of my aperture, I'm thinking, how wide can I go? Depth of field, generally speaking, is not that big a deal, especially in street photography if you're using wider angle lenses, because it's not as apparent. The loss of depth of field is not as apparent. And usually you want the background elements, because there's so much going on, you want them to be a little soft anyhow. You want your point of focus sharp. You want where you want to be sharp, sharp. But the rest of it frequently is okay if it's not as sharp. If that's not the case, then as I say, I will stop down. But generally speaking, I'm thinking as wide as possible. Shutter speed as fast as possible, because again, you're dealing with stuff that's moving and there's motion and movement. So you want to keep the shutter speed as fast as possible to stop and freeze that motion. Generally speaking, there are situations, and I will show you here, where I have used slower shutter speeds to create effects that are quite nice with street stuff. But I'm usually thinking, how fast can I get the shutter speed? So usually I'm going as wide open as possible, keeping the shutter speed as fast as possible. There are variations and there's exceptions to that. The ISO, I keep it as low as possible. And that means anywhere from 100 to 6400. Again, has everything to do with the situation. I know that's a real wide range, but I increase my ISO grudgingly. I usually want to keep it as low as I possibly can to achieve what I want. But as I get into real low light stuff, if I'm shooting after dark and I'm out on the street and there's not a lot of light, then I'm running the ISO up as I need. That's also why I like to keep it manual. I like the manual ISO so that it's not flipping to a higher ISO than what I want. So I grudgingly move it up. Any questions so far about using setting up your camera? And I don't see the chat, so I guess the questions are going to have to come. You're going to have to just kind of shout them out.
That's an old chat. It's probably Bob. Click on it, yeah.
Okay, let's move on.
Not Bob.
All right. Yeah, if you don't mind monitoring the chat, I don't see it on my screen here. I can't seem to activate it, but. All right, so we'll go on to the section that I call your presence, your vibe. And one of the first things that I do, it comes down to how I handle the camera. And as a photographer, when I'm out on the street, the last thing I want to be sort of presenting myself as is this, where the first thing somebody sees when they look at me is this camera. It's right there. So what I do is I actually wrap the camera around my wrist. I wrap it, this is a different camera, a little older camera, but I wrap the camera around my wrist with a neck strap like that. Or I've switched my neck straps to the slings that go across, and that's kind of nice because it slings the camera down on your hip and it's out of the way. It's there. If I need it, it's right there and I can use it. Boom, I've got it right there. But it's not the first thing that people see. It's not the first thing that they relate to, because the most important part of street photography, I believe, is that relationship between the photographer and the subject, and punching through that sort of camera apparatus that, to me, gets in the way of that. So I like to keep the camera out of the front and down by the side or in my hand when I can bring it up when I need to. I'm not hiding it, it's there, but it's not like the first and foremost thing that people see. So I'm going to walk through how I took this photograph and kind of give you an idea how I work while I'm out on the street. This photograph was done in a little mountain town in Italy. And I don't speak Italian. I have a hard enough time speaking English, and I've spent the last 5 years traveling extensively in Mexico, and mi español is muy limitado. So I am very poor with foreign languages. I wish I was better, but I am not the best. And certainly I don't speak Italian. But I think it's important. It's an important part of the way that I work to obtain permission of the subject before I photograph them. Now, there's a variety of ways that you can do that. One is you walk up and you say, "Can I take your photograph?" And if they speak English or understand English, and they can say yes or no accordingly. That's the least, that's the way that I do it the least. I usually am not that frontal with it. I ask permission through a series of eye contact and perhaps a gesture, and I watch and observe. Social scientists believe that something like 85% of our communication is nonverbal, and I would agree with that. A lion's share of the way that we communicate with others is not verbally, but through body posture, gestures, facial expressions, and a variety of other things. And I use that, and I use that extensively when I'm working the street. So I came to this situation. I had my camera. They all saw that I had the camera. I acknowledged the group. I made eye contact with all of them, because there I am, a foreigner walking up and stepping right into the midst of this game that was taking place. And so I kind of put myself into their space. They acknowledged me. They accepted me. It was obvious. They smiled. They nodded. They greeted me. I greeted them, and I watched the game for a while. I raised the camera and I took a picture, and then I checked back in with them. I looked at all of them, made eye contact. They didn't have any exception to it at all. They were fine with me taking photographs. So now I've gotten their permission to photograph this event. So I'm there and I'm watching and waiting, and I'm taking some photographs while they're playing the game. And this is the moment I chose to take the photograph. The older guy there, I don't know what he's telling his partner, but he's giving him what for playing the wrong card, because you can see the opposing team just took that trick. And that was sort of the interaction that I wanted to capture. The camera a lot of times is an excuse, and it's an excuse to go out and meet people and get into situations. I travel a lot in Newfoundland. Newfoundland has this really, to me, a very strange a way of camping. When you go to Newfoundland, they call it the Rock. Basically, it's a huge rock that's up on the Atlantic Ocean, and it's rocky everywhere. And then there's bogs on this rock all over the place. It's beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. Of course, there's some forests and trees and streams and lakes, and it's a very beautiful countryside. I noticed this very peculiar habit that Newfies have. They camp in abandoned gravel pits. When you drive around, you'll see these old gravel pits, and you can tell they're not mining there anymore, but there's a bunch of campers in them. And I thought that was really weird. So I was driving along and I saw one, and this one had just scads and scads of campers in it. And I pulled in and I went up to this woman and I said, "Excuse me." I said, "Can you tell me what's going on here?" And she kind of looked at me and said, "Well, what?" I said, "Well, you guys are camping in this abandoned gravel pit. And I'm from Minnesota, and we don't camp in abandoned gravel pits." And she said, "Well, yeah, we camp here." I said, "Well, why don't you camp out in the woods? It's beautiful out there." And she kind of looked at me weird, and she said, "Well, if we want to go to the woods of the lake, we just hop on the four-wheeler and go out to the woods of the lake. Nobody bothers us here, and it doesn't cost anything. Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from Minnesota, and we don't camp in gravel pits. Do you suppose I can take some photographs?" "Oh God, yes, go ahead. Take any of the photographs you want." So I walked back to the car and I got my camera out. And as soon as I took out my camera, all these people they came over to me. I mean, they're coming from their little campsites. They come over, "What's going on? What are you up to?" They're just curious. They want to know. I said, "Well, I'm from Minnesota, and we don't camp in gravel pits there. And I thought I'd take a few photographs to show some of my friends back home." They said, "Oh yeah." They said, "You should come back at night. It's great. It's really nice. People light up, and they're campers." And I started looking, and these campers, they're built in, man. These things, and they're telling me that they're handed down from generation to generation. And they said, "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" I said, "No, I don't. I haven't gotten a hotel yet." They said, "Well, you see that black van over there? We got a double bed in the back of that. You're welcome to stay there if you want." So I came back that night. They had these things lit up. They built porches on them. I mean, it's like their summer cabin. It just happens to be in an old abandoned gravel pit. So I went back and photographed the area at night, and it was a great way to meet people and engage. And I sat around and I bought a 6-pack of beer before I went back, and I had the 6-pack. I drank about 2 or 3 of the beers and left them there, and then I left the next day, and I got a text actually from one of the gals. She said, "You forgot your beer. It's here." I said, "Well, I'll pick it up next time I'm through." 2 years later, I came through again. Left a note on their camper and said, "Hey, I'm back for my beer, but you're not here." So now we're gonna move on. You're gonna see a bunch of work from Mexico, because as I say, I've been working Mexico for the last 5 years. I've been doing a series that I call Travels in Mexico, and I just feel I finished that project this year, and I'm going to be creating a book. It's a series of writing as well as my photographs. And one of the things that you face as a photographer and as a street photographer that I face, I'm a Norwegian Lutheran. If there is a more reserved people on the face of this earth, I don't know who they would be than a Norwegian Lutheran. And that's the way I was raised. And so it's very easy for me to draw back into my shell, into my roots as being a reserved Norwegian Lutheran. And that doesn't work for street photography. You need to put yourself out there. You need to really project yourself out. I'm a big believer that if you put yourself out into the world, you get back what you put out. If what you're putting out is being very reserved and very shy, you're not going to get a whole lot of interaction. But if you put yourself out there and you engage with people, they're going to engage right back. And it's that positive interaction. It is that mutual identification as human beings and what our base human desires and interests are that I'm interested in capturing. And when I see and I notice in myself that I'm reverting back into my Norwegian Lutheranism, I know that I have to bust out of that when I'm going out to photograph. And so I have a couple strategies for dealing with that. One is that I start photographing little things, boom, boom, little details around the scene until I sort of engage somebody or I get enough courage up that I can approach people and start photographing them. And it gives them a chance to see me photograph, accept me. I can tell as I read them, as I said, I can read people, read their reaction and see what's going on with them and how they're either accepting me or not in that situation. And the second method that I use is a little more direct. It's sort of like jumping in the deep end. I go up to the biggest, baddest guy I can find and ask him if I can photograph him. And so in this case, there was this guy. I mean, he looked like he probably just got right out of the joint or something, but he had this wonderful t-shirt on. And I'm like, hey, you're not Irish. He's like, yeah, I am. And so he kind of posed and I took his photograph. This was another one where I'm in this town in the streets and I saw this guy walking down the street and I'm like, hey, can I photograph you with your chicken? He's like, yes, he's very proud. And it wasn't actually until after I photographed and I got back and downloaded the images, I looked at this image and went, hey, wait a second. That's no chicken. That's a rooster. He was on his way to the cockfight and he was very proud of his fighting cock. Judging by the size of those talons and feet, I think that rooster probably did pretty well. So engaging people is a big part of what I like to do. The camera, as I say, gives me an excuse to reach out and interact with people. This was a restaurant that I stopped at for lunch, and these ladies were very, very attentive. They were very excited to have me there. I was there with a girlfriend of mine, actually, and we were traveling around the countryside, and this was a very small town. Actually on the slopes of Orizaba, which is the largest mountain in Mexico. It's like the third largest in North America. And it's an inactive volcano. 18,400 feet is what it gets up to. I wasn't that high here. You can only drive up to about 11,000 feet or so. But I was exploring the countryside and we went into this little street side diner, and these ladies were serving me food and they were very attentive. They were asking me if I had enough to eat, if I would like more to drink, did I like the food that I was being served, would I like to go out dancing with them. I turned them down on the last request, but I'm sure it would have been fun had I gone. And so at the end, I asked them if I could photograph them, and they posed for me for this photograph. As we left, we walked across the street to get in the car, and the five of them were lined up in the door waving goodbye to me. And Christina called them my fan club. So I liked this guy. I just liked his vibe. He was sitting there on the street, and I asked him if I could photograph him. He was fine. A young lady selling tamales. I think it's important, that you're aware of the street and what's going on. That is a very large part of going out and doing street photography. This is a very quiet photograph. This isn't one that sort of jumps out. But I love the curtains in these doorways and the slight breeze sort of blowing them around. And I thought that the black and white treatment was real nice. This is a artist, a very famous artist in Oaxaca. And her name is slipping my mind right now, but we went to her studio and she was talking with us, and I loved that strong diagonal light with the figurines behind her that she had created, and that she had such a wonderful face. So I was able to capture that here. We're going to jump around a little bit. This is in Africa, a brick maker, a young boy. Most of the time I'm shooting with really wide angle lenses. This is a rare occasion where I had a really long lens that I pulled out because I wanted to do some portraits of these very beautiful people. And I wanted that nice soft background. So back in Mexico, some kids at a weaving shop that we met. Street scene. This is in Morelia, not too far from where the butterflies, the monarch butterflies, winter over. So this young woman had this stunning costume as a monarch butterfly. This is a granddaughter and grandmother running a little restaurant in a mercado where we stopped and had lunch. This was in the town of Puebla. I spent 6 weeks in Puebla 1 year studying Spanish for all the good that it did me. No, it gave me sort of a very basic understanding of the language. It was really nice to get that. But I was walking down the street. You gotta love Mexico. Mexico, one of the things I love about Mexico is entrepreneurial spirit of the people. So I'm walking down the street, the sun shower comes along, the sun's shining, and it starts raining. Instantly, there are umbrella salespeople all over the street. Just, I mean, they came out of the woodwork and started selling umbrellas. And that's one of the things that I love about the Mexican culture, is that sense of entrepreneurial spirit. Boy, you need something, they're right there. And so I was standing on this street corner as it's raining, and I had my camera. I had actually one of those little pocket cameras, which I pulled out, and I saw this scene, and these people were looking at me. They're looking at me because I pulled the camera out. And so instead of engaging them, I went like that. I turned and looked up towards where the light was coming, and they kind of naturally followed my gaze. And when they did that, that's when I took the photograph. In this case, I thought the frontal was just a little bit too direct, and I wanted them to kind of be looking towards the light. And so that technique where I just went like this, they followed me and I took the shot. Walking down the street, I saw this woman looking out of her little window, and I raised the camera and asked her if I could take her picture. And she just, un momento, por favor. She ran back in and got a bouquet of these flowers that she had raised to show me. She was very proud of her flowers and presented those as I took her photograph. This is Jacques, the chef in Tuscany, and he made some of the best shrimp scampi that I've had anywhere. A fisherman in Newfoundland. And this is a retired guy, and Hank, I believe is his name, and I was out exploring the countryside, came across him. He was sawing up his winter wood in chunks. So that's what he was doing here. He's sawing his winter wood and stacking it. And 2 years later, I was traveling, and I was traveling with a girlfriend, and she said, you know, everywhere we go, you know, people, it seems like everywhere we go, you know, she goes, I want to go someplace you haven't been before. And we're out driving these back roads in Newfoundland and all these little inlets. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't think I've been to this area here. So let's go drive over there. So we're driving down these back roads. Well, it ended up that these back roads connected to the same spot. We drove out to the end of this little point out there, and there was Hank sawing his wood. So the girlfriend was like, I tell you, we can't get away from a place that you don't know somebody. And I pull up in the car and looked at Hank and said, you haven't gotten done sawing that wood yet? That's a molasses pie. And those are the gals that bake that pie. And this was in a deli in Fogo Island off the coast of Newfoundland. And I told them I'd buy the pie, but only if I could take their photograph with it. So they said that was okay. So I took a photograph of them back in the kitchen with their pie. These are some fishermen from Newfoundland. The brand new boat. They had just launched this boat. The captain is that guy in the second row with the green jacket on. He was very proud of his boat. And they had just gotten back from their first run. They had 30,000 pounds of fresh crab they were unloading. And they were very, very accommodating. They invited us on the boat to take a tour and asked us if we wanted some fresh crab. Unfortunately, we had no way to prepare it, so we had to turn them down. So when I travel, and particularly when I travel in Mexico, I stick out. I stick out like a sore thumb. I'm a big gringo. And this is a bunch of kids, but I mean, even in the adults, I kind of tend to tower over the adults, and I'm very, very different. And so, as I say, if you put yourself out there, they are more than willing to engage, and they want to engage. We happened to walk into this courtyard in this, it was a very public area. And there was a group of school kids getting their graduate picture taken by a professional photographer. Well, as soon as these guys, it was the guys in the back row, saw me, and as soon as they saw me, they were like, "Hey, amigo, por favor, come here." You know, they wanted to get photographed with me. So I came and I posed with them. I no more than got done with that, and I started walking away. I took a few photographs of them, and we kind of bantered a little bit. I started walking away, and the father of this young woman, this was a very popular area. It was a very pretty little courtyard in this town, so there was actually a couple different photo things going on. And this professional photographer was taking photographs of this young woman, probably for quinceañera. This is something you'll see more photographs that I take of. And the quinceañera is the 15-year-old celebration, which in Latino culture is very important for young girls. It's the marking of them coming of age. And she was dressed up in the very traditional gown and being photographed by the photographer. Her father came running over, grabs me by the arm, and literally drags me over to pose with his daughter because he wanted a photograph of the gringo with his daughter. So I complied. And that's sort of when I'm out working the street, it's sort of a funny dynamic that I adopt if I'm good and I'm on, and I'm not always on. Sometimes, like I say, I can easily revert back into that very reserved thing, and I have to check myself on that. But if I'm on and I'm doing what I want, there's this funny dynamic of being out, putting yourself out there, and then also kind of tend to fade back because there are opportunities that you want where you're not the center of attention, but yet there's still this dynamic and this interaction with my subjects. And that's the way that I approach it. Any questions on that so far? Okay, I'll keep moving. So the next section that I have is sort of using light. Light's an important part of what we do as photographers, is capturing light, and the more interesting the light, probably the better the photograph. So that means I tend to be up early in the morning or out late in the evening to capture the light that's more interesting. Midday light tends to be very tough, especially for street stuff. It can be very, very challenging. I have a good friend fellow photographer. And I love what he has to say about light. He says, bad light is good light. And I think that is true to a certain degree, that the worst sort of, usually the worse the atmospheric or light conditions are, the more challenging they are, the better the photograph can be. So if it's really what most people think, oh, it's a beautiful sunny day. I hate sunny days. Give me overcast, give me very early light, give me very late light, but not midday sun. That tends to be the worst. It's very challenging to work under and get good photographs. So I'm looking at those situations where I can use, especially mixed light with twilight with artificial light is usually the best for street stuff. This situation right here, this is actually all candlelight. It was well after the sun had set. I think this photograph was taken around midnight or something like that. This is during the Day of the Dead down in Oaxaca. Absolutely wonderful celebration and experience that celebrates life to a high degree. Even though the name is Day of the Dead, it's really a celebration of life and the people that have come before us. This is a photograph in Africa. I liked the way that the background was lit by that little kerosene lantern in the background, which gave a warm glow, pulls the viewer into the photograph. There's sort of a blend of the existing light, daylight out there with the nice artificial light in the background. This was in Denmark, a young military lieutenant, and demonstrating his dress outfit and how it's worn. I positioned myself with him by a doorway, which was lit. The light sort of frames around him and kind of pops him from the background. This was a street photograph done down in Mexico. Again, just one of the little pocket cameras that I carry with me all the time, so I always have a camera. I looked at this scene and I thought, this is a perfect scene for Mexico. It's iconic Mexican street landscape. These small towns, well-lit main street leading up to the hill, and the cathedral of the church built on the hill, which dominates the landscape, and that Catholic influence on the Mexican culture as the shining beacon on the hill. When I took this photograph, naturally it was color because I shoot in raw mode on my cameras. So everything I capture is color, but converted to black and white. And I converted it to black and white because it works better as black and white. It works, the lighting and the church become more prominent. The leading line of the lit street leading you up to the church on the hill works much better in black and white than it did in color. Also, I was able to tone down the sides more. There was some light that was spread out on the right and left side, but in post-process, black and white gives you a little bit more malleability as far as what you can do with the image for burning and dodging, lightening and darkening certain areas. And in this case, the sides needed to be darkened down to create that effect more of the main street leading the eye up to the church. This is another one from Mexico. This is the arena judge. And I love the fact that his face is totally black. It's a silhouette. He's the judge. He's the faceless judge. So he should be in total silhouette. Here we have some very strong directional light. I like the way it captured the features of my travel companion and friend, Tommy, set against the church, which is ubiquitous, as I say, in Mexican culture. This is this photograph was done on a highway that's called Espanzo del Diablo, or Backbone of the Devil, and it runs between Mazatlan and Durango. And in typical sort of Mexican melodramatic style, the number of that highway is Route 666. And it is a windy little road that travels, and it's about an 8 or 9 hour trip to take this road from Mazatlan on the coast to Durango in the interior. At one time, it was considered the most dangerous highway in Mexico, not because of banditos, but because of accidents, because it was a very narrow, windy little road. And it was very popular because it was the only route between those two cities, which are two major cities, and lots of trucks and stuff. And so there were a lot of accidents, people going off the road and dying. So in 2012, they opened a new road that went from Durango to Mazatlan, 83 tunnels and 86 bridges. The original road doesn't have a single one of either. So it cut the travel time down to about 2.5 to 3 hours from about 8 to 9 hours. So that's the one that everybody uses. So the old road, which is still there, is actually a wonderful drive to take as a tourist because there's nobody on it. And you can take your time. And this is a little shrine that you'll see these shrines all over the place along highways in Mexico. And this is one that was built. This one in particular really benefited from the conversion to black and white. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in the lower right, you see that there's some fencing down there. There's a little fencing. There's wire fencing around the shrine. But then in the lower right, there's some other fencing. And you'll notice that that is that plastic, that orange plastic fencing that you will see a lot of times. And that stuff, it was just garish looking in color, but the conversion to black and white and it drops that, plus the sort of atmospheric quality of the light worked really well in black and white. Oh, duplicate shot. I didn't catch that. Sorry. This one is I included because we have this couple sort of walking in what looks like to be the last rays of the sun that's sort of hitting them. Actually, it was a street light that's just off camera to the left that's illuminating that little area, and it sort of spotlights them and sets them off against the building and the stormy skies above, which I thought worked really well. Nice soft light with this canoeist as he's turning to come into shore. And then I think this is the last one in this section. I like this situation very, this is in Duluth, where actually I spend my time now when I'm in Minnesota. And they rent out those scooters that people stand on and they're powered, they're little electric scooters and you can ride them around. And so there was this gal zipping around and I'm like, hey, come here. And she thought I was going to get all upset because I was getting in her phone. I'm like, no, that's fine. It's cool. Hey, can you take your scooter and just kind of weave, do lots of S shapes as you go down this walkway? And she said, so she's like, yeah, sure, I can do that. So that's what that little white line is. It's she had a little tail light on this thing, and that's the tail light on this little scooter as it winds down the walkway. So I used that situation to create what I thought was an interesting visual element. Oh, I guess I got one or two more. That blending of twilight, like I say, that's something I'm looking for frequently. All right. So that's the section on light. Any questions? I do see we have.
Let's see.
Yes, it looks like Lynn Pedler asks, what post-processing programs do you like to use? Everything I do is using the Adobe products, and I use Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. So I don't use Lightroom. I teach Lightroom, ironically, for the printmaking workshops, but I don't use it. I don't like it. I'm old school. I prefer using Bridge, the browser program. It takes a little more storage space, but storage space is pretty cheap these days, so I'll invest in that. I find Lightroom to be kind of buggy, quite honestly, in working with it with other photographers. They're always fighting, it's dropping their catalogs, or it's doing other stuff the way that they're saving things and they're having a hard time finding them. Perhaps if I was more proficient in the catalog aspects of Lightroom, it wouldn't be quite as a challenge, but I prefer using Bridge, the browser, and the Adobe Camera Raw Converter, which works just fine. And it's identical in its post-process capabilities to Lightroom. And then I finish stuff off in Lightroom. Any other questions about lighting? All right, so let's talk about when to press the shutter, the decisive moment. As a street photographer, reading the street and choosing not only when you press the shutter, but your vantage point prior to when you press the shutter is a very important part of capturing a scene that works. So in this particular situation, this was in a little, actually not a little town, it's a pretty big city called Puebla, which is south east of Mexico City, about 2 hours. They have a beautiful town square and there's a huge cathedral there. And I was there, this was a Saturday night, and there was probably a wedding or something that was going on. And it was just getting out. And so all these people were coming out, and they were very nicely dressed in gowns and stuff. And I saw these young ladies there, and I think I might have winked at them right before I took the photograph, but I got a reaction, which was nice. So again, this was a situation, I saw the potential. I chose my position of where I wanted to be. I raised the camera and I engaged them with a wink. And that was the reaction that I got as I took the photograph. This was another situation. I'm sitting on a rooftop where there's a restaurant, and I walk over to the edge and I see this scene. This is actually in the mountains where the monarch butterflies are, in one of the little villages up there. It's a jumping off point before you go up to see the monarch butterflies. And I saw this scene that unfolded before me, and I thought, this is perfect. And so I timed the photograph so you get that kid as he's running up to kick the ball to his sister, their little street game of soccer between a brother and a sister with their dog. To me, that makes this photograph, that little moment that's taking place down there, captures that moment, and it becomes a timeless photograph because of that. Caballeros, asking for what caballeros want most after they're on their horse. A beer. 3 cervezas, por favor, is what they are gesturing to the vendor who's just off the camera to the right. And so I saw this situation, I positioned myself, and then they happened to just ask for the beer while I was there, which was like perfect. So I caught the gesture. This is one of my favorite photographs from Oaxaca. This was a wedding in typical sort of Mexican culture. Weddings are a huge deal, and they are a very public affair. So typical wedding ceremony will take place in the church and might last a couple hours. And then once the church service is over, the entire entourage goes outside, and they are met by another entourage that's hired. And that entourage is very typical to include a band that is playing instruments, a variety of instruments, drums and horns, tuba, all kinds of things like that. And then puppeteers or women and men dressed in traditional clothing to accompany the marriage and bridal party as they go up and down the streets, drinking and celebrating and dancing for the celebration of the marriage. Anybody that's been a wedding photographer knows that there is one person on the wedding day. Now, there's all these other people that are there. There's really only one person that's the most important person, and that is the bride. And so I wanted to capture this feeling of all this activity and energy and movement that was swirling around the bride. And so I positioned myself so that I could catch that as there was this swirl of activity that's going around, and took a number of photographs. And this is the one that I captured that turned out just right, because the break in the people was just so that you could center the bride, you could see her. The photograph was taken at a fairly slow shutter speed. This was with one of those pocket cameras that does not have in-body stabilization. So I think it was shot at around an 1/8 to a 15th of a second. You catch the movement, the blur of the people as they're swirling around. Because the bride's in the center, she, if you zoom in real tight, she is just a little soft, but she holds enough sharpness to carry the effect that I was after, which was she's the center of all this action and activity that's swirling around her. Day of the Dead, even the kids get into it. And again, they're entrepreneurs. I mean to tell you, they learn these skills from very early on. So this was during Day of the Dead, and these kids were street actors that were posing for photographs. And their manager is this gal that to the left that's giving me the eyeball, because I hadn't paid her yet. And she was taking the money for photographing these kids. So I gladly gave her some pesos after I got this photograph. But I love the dynamic, the kids, the one sitting on the end mourning the dead kids, and then their manager there. So this is a place called Jeve del Agua, which is frozen waterfalls, and it's near Oaxaca. It's a beautiful area. There are these spring seeps that come out of this calcareous limestone rock and seep and flow over the cliff, which you can't see. It's on the other side of this, and they create this calcification of the rock that turns white, and then this water just sort of seeps and flows very thinly over this white calcified rock, and so it looks like a frozen waterfall. And this particular, there's this pond. You can see they built this wall, and there's a pond there where the water was. And when I first went over there to take the photograph, what I had envisioned in my mind was this sort of this dead tree, the mountains, and this reflecting pond. And when I got there, then this guy went out to get his photograph taken by somebody that was with him, who actually was next to me. And I saw this great opportunity for what I felt was a stronger photograph than without the person. This sort of faceless silhouette guy standing there kind of gives it a perspective and adds a dynamic to it. Pigeons in a square. They all took off, and yeah, they flew right by me. I mean, I think I felt the wings beat against my hat a couple times. This is a celebration during Fat Tuesday in a little village up in a mountain, which consists of these people. You can see they have these very strange costumes and the big hats, the big conical hats. And then there's a band. We were expecting a parade, and really it's just a mass of people with a band that's loosely called a band, making a lot of racket. And then this flag, which is sort of the centerpiece of this parade, if you will. And it consists of a lot of drinking. There's a lot of drinking that's been taking place here. And this is actually right sort of at twilight. And so they wave this flag as violently as they can. They're just whipping this flag all around. And after about 20 seconds of doing that, whoever's doing it is exhausted. And so somebody else jumps in there and grabs a flag from there and starts whipping it around as fast as they can. It was a very curious celebration. It was kind of fun to photograph. We jump back to Africa. Note that when I took the photograph, the timing on this photograph, I waited until we got in this canoe, we're crossing the Nile. And as I'm crossing the Nile, instead of looking forward, I turned around and looked back at the guys paddling, and I watched them. And so when they were sort of in mid stride as far as their paddle, it formed this wonderful triangular shape, which made a great composition. And that's when I took the photograph. My daughters, I threw this one in there. When they were younger, they're fully grown now and they have families of their own. They were 14 and 16 respectively, Megan and Aaron, Megan on the left, Aaron on the right. And at that time in their life, I don't think you could have put them in the same room together because they fought like a couple cats, boy. They were just, like siblings can be at that age. And they'd fight. So this was a very difficult time. I had just gotten divorced. They had been through the divorce, very difficult time for girls to go through a divorce. I said, look, let's take a trip. We'll take a road trip. We'll go out to Maine. And they were very excited about that. I told them that we would stop in Quebec City. Quebec City is a wonderful town. It's a walled town. It's like going to France in North America. It's just amazing. And so we took this 2-week road trip. Now, I have to tell you, I had certain reservations after I said that I would do this with the two of them in the car together, because you couldn't put them in the same room together. They weren't sniping at each other. So I told them, I said, look, if this is going to work, we're going to spend 2 weeks together. You guys have to get along. Oh, we will, Dad. We will. Don't worry. So we had a wonderful trip. It was a very cathartic experience for all of us, having gone through a very difficult situation and time in our lives. And we went out to the Maine coast, and we're out on the Maine coast, and they were having this moment where they were coming together. And I saw the opportunity for this photograph, the two little rock islands out there in the distance, totally separate, close, not quite touching, but distinctly different entities, and the two of them having this moment. I like the metaphor of that in this photograph. And so it's one of my favorite captures of them. Now, I got to tell you, I just have to finish this with a real quick story about what happened after this. So we leave Maine and we start driving back to Minnesota. We're going through New Hampshire, which is like Stephen King territory, right? And the two of them get into a huge argument in the car. It was the first altercation that they had on the entire trip. And I'm driving the car, and it came to blows. One of them was sitting in the front seat, and the other was sitting in the back seat, and they started trying to hit each other. They were so upset about what they were arguing about. And I pulled the car over and stopped the car. And it took them a good minute before they realized that the car wasn't even moving. And I was just sitting there. And then they stopped their fighting and they said, Dad, what's wrong? I said, look, I can't be driving the car down the road with you two guys trying to get into fisticuffs. You have to come to an agreement on this before we can go on. So they amended things and acquiesced that each other's viewpoint was valid. You know what they were arguing about? The literary merits of Stephen King. I'm biting my lip because I'm finding this extremely hilarious, actually, and think Stephen King would have gotten a big kick out of it as well. But so this was I did this military bands project I worked on, and I went all over the place and photographed these military bands mounted on horseback. And this was in Denmark, and I was photographing these two. This band actually, and they were ready to, before they went out on this parade, they were all done up in their finery. And so I'm standing in front of these guys, and the same sort of thing is that it was too frontal. I took some photographs with both the horse and the guy looking at me, but it was kind of frontal. So I did the same thing. I just held the camera here. I looked this way. The guy followed my gaze. He loosened his grip on the horse just a little bit. The horse happened to look the other way. And I thought that's a great opportunity. That's when I took the photograph. I was following these geese around, photographing the geese, and I just kept following them as they walked right in front of this great old Caballero sitting there. And I got his portrait along with the ducks. That's the south end of a northbound bull at a county fair. This is another county fair in Minnesota. And I met these young ladies. These are 4-Hers. And so I asked them if they would pose with their geese, and they said, sure. So they came, I actually photographed this with this was taken a while ago, and I photographed it with a 4x5 view camera that I had set up. It's a camera you go under the dark cloth with. So I composed where I wanted to have the photograph, and then I was going to take them out and pose them in the place. And they came out and they had all the geese with their heads facing backwards with their butts forward. I'm like, no, I can't take a picture of a bunch of geese butts. You got to turn them around. So this was after they got them turned around, but this was the scene as they were trying to turn these geese around, which of course I had to capture. So I caught them with as they turned the geese around and got them. This is down here in Utah, actually a little bit further south in Monument Valley, on the Navajo Nation. I am on my way down there. Actually, as soon as I finish this talk, I'm going back down to the Navajo Nation. I've been working with the community education down there and started teaching some photography workshops. I'm very excited. I'm going to be going back down to line up what I'm going to be doing with them next fall. This is a woman by the name of Helen. She actually lives right between the mittens. She is grandfathered in, if you will. Her place is right there between the two mittens, and that's her hogan that she's headed to on the left. This is a typical scene inside of a hogan that's there. This is actually a different hogan with another couple that live in Monument Valley. And she's spinning yarn. So I love this photograph of the cathedral in Oaxaca. This was a scene that was presented to me. There was a woman who was posing for her friends to photograph, and I liked including a little larger part of it. There's a metaphorical aspect to this, which I find very intriguing. The saints that are depicted in stone on the facade of the building, the important people, right? The important people in the power structure of the church. And then her standing there occupying, so in visual terms, and equal to those important people, which I thought was a nice metaphor. Any questions on when to press the shutter, timing? All right, I'm going to talk about black and white or color. So when I photograph, I mean, I'm capturing in the raw setting on the camera, which means that I'm getting all the data, which means I'm getting color. And then I convert, if I want to convert to black and white after the fact. And a lot of times I'm pre-visualizing what it is that I'm trying to capture, thinking about it and going, this is going to be a black and white, or this is going to be a color. I'm going to photograph it in a certain way to think about what the final image is like. I try to do that as much as possible. Street photography can be very challenging that way because things are changing at a very rapid rate. But a lot of times when I go into a situation or a scene, I will have preconceived notions about what it is that I want to capture, how I want that image to look. There are 3 times that the image changes substantially in the life of the image. The first time is what is in reality in front of our camera versus what the camera captures. That's a very dramatic change because you're looking at 4 dimensions of reality, 3-dimensional space and time that's rendered into a flat 2-dimensional document about that, a capture of that. So that's a very significant transition. the next transition that happens that's very significant is what you see on the back of the camera, the little viewfinder of the camera, versus what you see on the computer. You notice and see things on the computer that you never saw on the back of the camera because it's a very small little feedback display. So the going up to a larger size on a computer screen allows us to see a lot more, and we have a better notion about what it is. Gosh, it wasn't quite sharp as where I wanted it, or whatever. If it's a we certainly the defects of the image jump right out at us if they're there. But we see a lot more on the computer screen. So it goes through a dramatic change between those two. And the third time that it changes quite dramatically is what we see on the computer screen versus going out to print, if we go out to print. And that changes quite dramatically. So there's 3 times that it changes quite significantly. And so there's 3 times that I'm pre-visualizing and making up my mind as far as what the final photograph is going to look like. And I try to do it from beginning to end at the very beginning, but a lot of times I'm fooled. So I have this notion, I capture the photograph, I bring it onto the computer screen, I change those notions. Some images work, some don't. I go with the ones that work. I think they're going to look this way. I make a print, and then I look at the print, and again, it may work or it may not work. I have to realign what my ideas are. So I sort of pre-visualize 3 times throughout the process, but you're making these transitions and changes. This is a situation where when I saw the situation, I thought that it would be a very different photograph. And what I saw when I photographed it was in color. And I saw this color and I went, wow, I love that suit. I love the outfit. And this was a little community dance up in a mountain village in Mexico. And I saw this guy and he's like dressed to the nines. I'm like, hey, can I take your photograph? He's like, yes. Do you want my wife? Of course, I'd love to have my wife pose with you. And I took the photograph. And when I brought it in the computer, I was just like, no, this doesn't work. For me, to me, it was the pride that comes through, that wonderful sense that look at us, we're stepping out on a Saturday night and we're in our best and we're going to go dancing. And that was what I really wanted to carry and capture. For me, it just gets lost in the color. So converting to black and white was the natural. It was a little bit of a surprise with that one. This scene I saw as we were driving down the road, there was a little pond that on the side of the road. I saw the crosses and I saw these fishermen and I thought, boy, if there was ever a stronger metaphor in a Mexican landscape, I don't know what it is. So I immediately stopped and got out and started photographing. I timed the photograph as he was casting the net, as he's throwing his net out over the water. And I saw this photograph as a black and white photograph. And when I made the conversion, I went, it's just not quite what I want. I kept it in color and immediately it popped more for me. It became a better photograph because you have that original color. And I think it's that red, the red of the guy that's in the back of the boat and then the red of that wall, which sort of brings the two together, the crosses, the fishermen in the foreground, and it really carried the day. So this was one that flipped. This one I saw, this was photographed, and incidentally, I had that Zeiss 12mm, which I think just does beautiful rendering of light and tone. And I saw this scene. This was a weaver in Chiapas. She was showing us her wares. The light was just gorgeous, and it was so colorful. And I was like, yes, this is the shot I want. And I caught her as she was sort of displaying or showing some of her weaving. I wanted to photograph her entire family. That was Catalina, a woman I've gotten to know quite well. Wonderful, wonderful woman. Went back there again this last year and they fed us absolutely amazing meal of tortillas and beans and rice. That was just, I mean, amazing. Tortillas that are a meal in and of themselves. So this is her sister and the rest of her family. And I wanted to capture a photograph of the entire family. With color, it just simply did not work. I think it was the blend of all the different colors and the different types of clothing that detracted, but in a conversion to black and white, and it worked perfectly because the textures and those beautiful faces come through much better. This one, however, a bunch of young ladies in traditional finery with the color was perfect. The light was really nice. It was an evening. We were out by the church, and there were these young ladies and their young escorts, the caballeros in the background that you see, and they posed so nicely for me. We hung around, and we were on this plaza, and there was actually, they had I think it was like their den mother or something was following around, was going to take some photographs, so she was going to pose them on the steps. And I kind of caught this sort of mid thing. Some of the girls had sat down, some hadn't gotten there yet. And I sort of liked the way that this image worked with all the different things that are going on, the different ways that the people are looking, so that the visual lines are sort of intersecting. This one, the color didn't work. It distracted from the content of the information. And that's what color can do. It can lull us in, so we're seeing color and we're not seeing some of what I feel is more important content. And so by taking the color away, it allowed the dynamic of the interaction, in this case with these ladies, that I thought was far better. This is off the Ponte Vecchio in Italy. Another street scene down in Mexico. Here we have a musician who was on the street, and I wanted to photograph him, and I just thought I loved the sort of muted colors of that he was wearing and how they sort of replicated with the background. He just happened to be sitting on this stoop of this door, and the sort of the purples and the blues and browns of what's on the adobe, as well as what he was wearing, and how that played off of each other. Here's another musician on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, and in this case, taking the color away because the background buildings became very distracting, maintaining the color. And you kept the black and white, which rendered actually his skin tones in this wonderful tonality, and you really caught the passion and the vibrance with which he's playing the trumpet. San Miguel de Allende, this is the cathedral in the background, and I just used these street vendor that had these balloon bubble things that he was selling on a stick, and I kind of got low and shot through those up through them with the cathedral in the background. Gives it a very sort of dreamlike quality, which again, I love that metaphor. It's a wonderful metaphor for a lot of these Mexican towns. It's like going into a different world. In the highlands in Mexico, if you haven't been to the highlands in Mexico, you haven't been to Mexico, because that's where the true Mexican culture is. And it is like it's like stepping into another kingdom. It's timeless. This is a street scene in Puebla. This is a Calle de, it's a Street of the Frogs is what I forget the Spanish. This is Queen's birthday review of the troops in Britain with the British Army, vibrant red. I mean, color, if the color's there, the color's there. It carries the photograph. It's an important part of the photograph. Here you have that wonderful warm facade of the Santo Domingo Cathedral de Santo Domingo in Oaxaca, against that deep blue twilight sky that sort of gives a nice contrast. Some tour boats in Tamachuco, where there's a great waterfall. Traditional dancers. This is you would see this particular event was not, this was just a celebration. This was not a wedding, but these are typical. You would see these dancers with the baskets with flowers that would accompany frequently would accompany the marriage processions afterwards, or in this case, this was just a celebration. The piñata lady. Gotta love that pink. And all her wonderful piñatas. The black cat really sets it off too, I think. More pink with the contrasting in the red. Here we have on the Nile in Africa, Uganda, very blue, atmospheric. That carries it. The color really carries this photograph. This is another very atmospheric one. This is on the slopes of Orizaba, where I was telling you that I was exploring. Those areas, went there for several days and photographed, and it was very foggy and hazy at this particular time of the year. I think it adds a real nice quality. Atmosphere, haze and fog can be great. This is a mercado where they're preparing meats, and so they're just barbecuing. A mercado is typically covered. It might be in a building, or as in this case, it's partly a building, and also you'll see tarps. You see those tarps that are stretched out over the vendors. So it tends to be more enclosed than just out on the street. And there's all kinds of stuff going on, and mercados are wonderful. And this was a mercado in a small town outside of Oaxaca, which is just amazing. There's the artisans and the sights and the smells and the stuff going on there is just absolutely wonderful. Oop, duplicate, sorry. This is the cathedral in San Cristobal de las Casas up in Chiapas, in the mountains in Chiapas. And in this case, I chose that vendor balloon, a very different way of using it, sort of in the foreground with this weird sort of cartoon shape, and then the very formal church in the background. And again, the black and white took the color away, which emphasized those two elements more so that it could come out, the image carried. This one, the conversion to black and white, I felt like this had a timeless quality to it. This could be 1955, not 2020 or 21 when it was photographed, but it has this sort of timeless feel to it because of the black and white. And this one is such a weird image relative to spatial relationships and what's going on. And again, stripping the color away made it a little bit more abstract, if you will. It's actually, we're standing on the top of a temple or a pyramid, La Catona, in northern Puebla state, with a mountain in the background, and has this strange dynamic to it. Cross on the wall, and I felt the conversion to black and white gave it a little more of an abstract feel, which kind of gave it like that white plaster around it, almost like flame-like. Remembering the dead in Cuernavaca. These are the disappeared. This is a famous case that happened down there. They're still battling, goes all the way up to the top reaches of the government. Something like 45 university students that were disappeared by the local militia. All right, so questions about black and white or color. It says, Patricia McAlvern asks me, given the brutality of the Mexican cartel, do you ever feel threatened when you're on the road less traveled? No, I don't. In fact, I feel quite safe in Mexico. I have traveled 5 years in Mexico, and I drive everywhere. When I first started, yes, I was much more cautious. Stayed to the highways, stayed to the paved roads, don't go down these back roads. Now I go pretty much everywhere. And I'll tell you why. There's a couple reasons why I don't feel threatened. I've seen and met cartel people. Cartels are a regular part of a lot of Mexican life. There's local government, city, there's state government, and there's federal government in Mexico, and there's cartels. And in many places, the cartels are they're ensconced. They're a part of the culture and a part of the society. There is a town just not far from San Cristobal de las Casas, Chamula, I believe is what it's called. I might be blanking on the name. Anyhow, when you enter that town, there's an archway over the entrance to that town. And what that archway says is, you are now entering the jurisdiction of Chamula. All local laws apply. State and federal police are not allowed beyond this point. A local, which is basically a cartel, runs that town. And there's an incredible church there that's sort of this weird blend of local beliefs and kind of Catholicism, although it's nothing like the Catholicism that any of us would recognize. And it's a beautiful church, and the rules are very stringent on photographing. You are not allowed to take photographs in the church. And in fact, if you photograph the wrong person or the wrong thing in that town, you will have your camera confiscated. You will probably be fined about 5,000 pesos, which is a pretty stiff fine, several $100s. And you'll never see your camera again. So consequently, I don't have any photographs in that town. I recognize that that is the law of the land, and I respect that, and I'm not going to push it. So I don't take any photographs in that town. There are other towns that are much more in that same area, which are much more amiable to being to photographing. In fact, Katrina, the weaver that I showed you, is in a neighboring village not far from that town. But I recognize the traditions and the culture that's there and respect that. If you take the State Department's own numbers, and you have to go pre-pandemic because I don't have post-pandemic numbers, pandemic screwed things up. So you go to 2018. 2018, there were 35 million Americans that went to Mexico. There were 75 Americans that were murdered in Mexico. That's a pretty small amount relative to 35 million. But if you take those numbers, 1 million are permanent residents, 34 million were there on vacation. If you use 1 week, which is a very conservative amount of time because most people go down there longer than a week, use 1 week, and you extrapolate those numbers, you end up with a murder rate per 100,000, which is the way statisticians figure these things. And you end up with 4.7 murders per 100,000 people. You know what the murder rate for the US in general is?
Nowadays,
5.3. Statistically speaking, you are safer as a US citizen in Mexico than you are in the United States. So the cartel, they don't want to mess with you. They know that if they mess with you, that the federales are going to be there making their life miserable. So they don't want to mess with you. Problem is, we get a lot of headlines. You probably have all heard the headlines that just happened where the cartel murdered those, I think it was there was 4 people and they murdered 3 of them, or 2 or 3 of them down near Brownsville in Texas, just across the border in the Monterey area. I've been to that area. And there is a lot of cartel activity. There's a lot of cartel drug activity, and they murdered the people. Well, what did the cartel do? Cartel found out the 5 people that were there, bundled them up and delivered them. Here's the 5 perpetrators of this. This was not sanctified action. Now that doesn't justify it. I'm not looking to justify it, but I'm looking to put it in a context. We're at, what, 146 mass murders in this country so far this year. so far this year. And you're worried about Mexico being a violent culture. Mexico is a violent culture. Mexico is a violent, if you're a drug dealer and you go to Mexico, it's a violent place and dangerous place to be. Murder is a crime of passion. And there is only one category that we lead Mexico in, because Mexico does have more murders per capita than what the United States does. If you're a Mexican, it's more dangerous than if you're an American in America. But what we lead them on is death by firearms. Most of the murders in Mexico are being done with a machete or a knife. That's a pretty intimate murder. It's a crime of passion. You have a greater chance of being murdered by the person sitting next to you than you do by a total stranger. But I would argue that if there was a study done in this country, that the United States would probably lead the world in stranger murders with the number of mass murders. So I find actually Mexican culture, generally speaking, to be very, very safe. So that's a long answer on that question. Any other questions?
Yeah. Elliot?
John, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I
Two
can.
questions.
Okay.
First of all, when you're converting to black and white, do you do things like boost the contrast, which I usually do?
Yes. Raw images, when you capture in RAW and you get the full range of all the information that's there, and it's actually just there's sort of, when you come into the raw converter, it's arbitrary settings that are set by the manufacturer of Adobe and the camera, how those things interact. And they're purposely set so that the image is pretty flat. It's there's not much punch to it. And that's fine. I like to start that way and build the contrast throughout my entire post-process processing in both black and white and color, but mostly in black and white. It's a process of sort of adding contrast throughout the whole post-process, excuse me, to get the punch that I want out of the image. So, yeah.
Okay, my second question, do you attempt to give your subjects copies of the photographs you take of them?
If I can, it's not always possible because of the way that I travel and where I go, that I'm able to give back. But certainly if I can, I do. This, and I actually feed this image up because this is a prime example. Driving down the road, I saw this young woman, and there's a whole entourage. Her family is there, and a professional photographer was there, and they were out in this field photographing her. It's late in the evening and the sun is setting. We saw the scene. My friend Tommy was driving. We drive in a Suburban. We got a great big Suburban, and we're driving down this country road, and we saw that, and both of us just like, Tommy hits the brakes and comes sliding to a stop with all this dust and everything. We're piling out of the car, grabbing our cameras, running down there, and they were sort of like, whoa, what's going on? Fortunately, the photographer was a wonderful woman who spoke flawless English, and welcomed us, and so we were able to photograph this young woman. And this was my depiction. This was actually in the initial sort of interaction. She had bouquets of flowers. She had a young girl that was posing with her in many of this. I liked her all by herself out in this very cold, barren landscape. I thought, again, the metaphor between a young woman coming of age in that culture, this was a strong image. And in this particular case, we were able to follow up with the photographer, and I sent a copy of this image down for them so that they could have it. I don't know if this would necessarily be one that they would want, but it was the image that I liked out of this and that I was able to get back to them. I posted the image of the bride, and several people thought, oh, you need to go give that image to the bride. Well, in that case, it was, I mean, one of several weddings that took place. This was a couple years ago. I was only in Oaxaca for 2 weeks. And so it was impossible for me to get back in touch with them. I actually, this last year, I spent 3.5 months down there. And there were instances where I was able to get images back to people that I had photographed. So if I can, yes, I will. But a lot of times, because of the way that I travel, I can't. The Orizaba, the slopes of Orizaba, I went out and we went there and I was driving around. I have a girlfriend, she's Mexican and she lives in Mexico City, and she came out and joined me and we drove around and this was December 23rd, and we're driving on the slopes of this mountain and I'm photographing and everywhere I go, I hear these kids would see me. My beard was even fuller, and these kids would see me and they go, "A Santa, a Santa, a Santa Claus." And so the next day we got up early, we went into a neighboring town and I bought a Santa hat and 2 big bags of candy. And we went back up and drove through those villages and handed out candy and they loved it. So it was a way of giving back to the community. And we're already planning a return trip for this next Christmas to go down and do something similar. I actually spoke to a local artist, very famous artist, Juan, and he's the son of the old woman that I photographed who does amazing stuff. And I told him, I want to buy about 75 little figurines from you. And so we're coming up with a commission that I can, so I'm not spending tons and tons of money, but something fairly simple and small, little figurines, so that with the candy, I can give them a sort of a little meaningful piece of art from their culture.
Thank you.
I've got a chat. Oh, it's just Patricia thanking me. I'm sorry I went on a little long. The moral and legal stuff, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to tell you that I am a lawyer in any way, shape, or form. But here's the thing. My belief is if you get to that point, you've lost the battle. And I'm all about making connections with people. I'm all about getting that connection with them rather than putting yourself in an adversarial situation with the subject. So the bottom line is that in a public place, you can photograph. It's not illegal. You can photograph. There is a famous case about 8 years ago of a New York photographer who photographed at the magic hour during when the light inside and outside was blended and it was the same. And he sort of did a Alfred Hitchcock Rear Window thing where he photographed the building across the way from him. And he used a long lens and went tight on the windows and photographed people in very intimate situations, maybe partially clothed, maybe in embraces, leading their lives in very intimate images of them, basically like a peeping Tom through the window. He then took those images and blew them up very large and had a huge display, an art display, in a prominent gallery in New York City. Many of his less than willing subjects saw that display and immediately sued him for invasion of privacy. And he won. And he won on the premise that there was no expectation of privacy because they left their blinds open.
Wow.
Now, I would not necessarily want to try that case in Minot, North Dakota. But in New York City, that was the level of expectation that the judge found. There was no expectation of privacy because they left their blinds open. So there is wide latitude for making art and editorial use of photography. However, again, in my mind, if you get to the point where it becomes a legal issue, you've already lost the battle. So I'm gonna finish with one other thing. I'm gonna invite you. I still have some spots on my Day of the Dead tour for 2023 in October through November. It's a wonderful place. Oaxaca is considered one of the safest cities in Mexico. And it's a wonderful celebration of life. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
So along the way, I've seen a few items written about street photography. I always wondered why. And obviously, most of us probably been on vacation, we've inadvertently done some street photography. So as your main, I guess, occupation, how do you actually market what you do?
Excuse me. He got me all worked up. Well, here's the irony. The irony is that I actually make very little money on my photography. Where I make my money and how I support myself are doing tours, on my expertise that I share with others. That is where I make most of my money, not selling my photographs. I love to print, and I do print a lot of images, and I display those images all over. I sell them from time to time, have different gallery showings or online, but it's not a mainstay of income for me, quite honestly. So, and I'm probably, the other irony is that I'm probably better known among my core group of followers. I'm better known as a landscape photographer than I am a street photographer. But I've always had this love for photographing people and street and stuff. It goes back, my degree when I was in college was called Documentary Expression of American Culture through Photography. It was a social photography that I was interested in, and I combined social studies and cultural anthropology with a art degree. And so that when I got out of college, I was like, okay, how am I going to support myself? And my photography led me down a very different path. And I ended up doing, because I worked a lot with, because I loved nature as well. I was sort of this strange dichotomy of social as well as nature. And I started photographing nature and started photographing back in those days of the 4x5, which led me to architecture and then gardens. Did a lot of garden stuff for garden magazines. And I did that for many, many years. So the mainstay of how I made my living as a commercial photographer was architectural and garden photography, not so much people, actually, although I have done a variety of different stuff related to people. I mean, I photographed weddings, I photographed events, conventions and cultural stuff like that, but mostly it was non-people how I made my living.
It was great. It was a great presentation, and it did open my eyes to other ways of taking photos. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or? Okay, John, we really appreciate your talk. Oh, that question.
All
In
right.
the back.
As today's technology, when you're talking about making money from your actual capturing with cameras versus educating people in using cameras, has that situation changed over the last 15 years?
Well, I actually started teaching almost as soon as I started photographing. The first time I taught was for a community education program in downtown Minneapolis, and people paid $6 for 4 sessions. And I like to say that they got their money's worth. It was very, very early on. Because I had a love for photography and a passion for photography, and an early photo teacher of mine saw that and saw that I was good with sharing knowledge about what I knew, the limited amount of what I knew, with others, and encouraged my teaching. And he sort of lined that up, which meant that throughout my career, I grew and developed both as a photographer as well as a teacher of photography. It was sort of, 30 some years at this now, and I've been growing in both ways. Now I'm, like I say, mostly teaching. Yes, things have changed in transitions. With film, it was a very different endeavor. The teaching was not as large a part of sort of what I did, both my income stream as well as the time that I spent on it. And it was more challenging back then with film. I mean, I remember we ran workshops up on the North Shore of Minnesota, up on Lake Superior, and we would run film runs down to Duluth, which is the nearest place where we could get film processed. And we would, in a 4-day workshop, we'd run 2 film runs so people could get 2 batches of film processed. And so the digital transformed things tremendously with the advent of digital, because we didn't need that. We had the immediate return of the images right away from the digital. So it shortened up that whole thing. Photography is this, I mean, it's this wonderful and curious thing. You do this thing, it's sort of this abstract thing that you create, and then there's a delay before you see it. And back in film days, it would be a long delay before you could see it. And I think in some ways that made us more careful about what we did. And with digital coming in, there was a much more immediate return on it. One, we could look at the back of the camera and see, oh, I'm either properly exposed, underexposed, overexposed, make those changes right away. But there was still a bit of a delay until you got it on the computer to really see what you've got and work with. But it was a much more immediate, much more accessible medium then with the advent of digital. And as we transpire and go through the latest thing, which is AI photography and the challenges that presents to us, it'll be very interesting to see how it continues to transform. But digital has opened up the doors. I mean, I feel that I have in my hands these days tools that allow me to create compelling and wonderful and beautiful images and captures of the world to a greater degree than I've ever had before with film. It's a double-edged sword. There's, in some ways, I think, like I say, the challenges of AI, which I think is going to rattle us to our core as far as straight photography goes. And we'll see how that transpires. But yes, it's changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years. Gotten better in some ways.
Well, you've been in photography for quite a while. Has the technology, on a professional point of view, in the middle of the marketplace, has that devalued, or has it increased or decreased?
It very much devalued. I mean, that's why I make my living teaching and not trying to be a commercial photographer. Back in my days of doing a lot of magazine work, that was mostly what I did for the gardens. I photographed, you name a garden magazine, national or regional in the Minnesota upper Midwest area, or even nationally, you name a garden magazine, I was published in it. I did a lot of garden stuff. A typical feature story for a garden magazine, I made anywhere from about $1,200 to $2,000 for that story. And that's in dollars in 1995 or so to 2005, in that sort of time period. So, you can double or triple that now because of inflation and stuff that's gone up. Nowadays, I mean, I haven't done a garden magazine story for years because it got to the point where they didn't want to pay you anything. They didn't want to pay you a bean burrito for it. It just wasn't worth it. And the digital has done wonderful things, but it's also the other side of that is it's devalued it. As a photographer that worked with a 4x5, that gave me a sort of a specialized niche of knowledge that architecture and construction firms were willing to pay me for and pay me quite well to go out and do. And then digital photography came in, and anybody with any kid with a computer that could do a transform on the image for perspective control became an architectural photographer. And it very much drove the price down. And it got to the point five years ago was the last time I did a commercial job that was architectural related. And it was because in the last couple of years, I mean, I had long-standing relationships with these companies, but younger people came in and they started looking at what I was doing and, well, why are you charging so much? I wasn't about to cut my rate. I didn't want to start going down that road. And it just got to the point where it's now they come back. Well, we've got a project where I was working with companies where they would just assign me the project. I'd go out and shoot and do the work and send them a bill, and they were happy. Everything was fine. And they told me, we love your work. We've never had a complaint on the cost or anything. It's great. So I would go out and I'd do this stuff. And then all of a sudden it became, well, why is this so much? And we've got a project for you, but we're only going to pay you $400. Not worth it. So I quit doing it and just started focusing all my energy over on teaching and workshops.
I don't think you're alone.
No, I'm sure I'm not. I know I'm not, because I talked to plenty of other photographers.
Mexico is one of my favorite places.
I'm sorry?
I said Mexico is one of my favorite places. And I've been pulled over by the rebels, and I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place, wonderful culture.
All right, anybody else? Well, John, thank you very much. You
You bet.
very insightful.
Thank you.
And when we do the Lightroom course, we can come sit in on. How have you heard me? Can you hear me, John?
I'm sorry, what was it?
Oh, I was saying, you had mentioned about Lightroom. I says, when we do the Lightroom course, you can sit in on it. Talk about catalogs.
Well, maybe you'll get me to do that. I don't know.
That's my baby, so.
All right.
Thank you so much, John. We appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we have a meeting in 2 weeks. I know it's photo sharing, and I'm sure Bob will send out a memo as to you know, what we have. The next meeting is the last one of the season. And then we're gonna do a summer session this year. The first, basically the second and fourth Tuesday in May, we're gonna do a landscape. In June, we're doing a second and fourth Monday, and it's gonna be black and white. And in July, we're gonna do the second and fourth Monday, and it's gonna be something lighting, macro. We're still working on that. We're, you know, getting together to make the program. More details will be announced. But looking forward to having a summer season again now that this COVID's over. Get together again. So, all right.
The way my camera starts. Stop diving. I have a bunch of batteries and shortages, which I just learned many of them may be useful for people who are still running and digital. I'm just going to give them away to somebody.
I am too.
Anybody here use Canon?
Yeah.
This is the last battery that I learned.
That's not mine.
Okay. The other one I think is dated.
They're not mine.
You know what you can do? You can send Bob an email and he can put it onto the website.
Yeah.
Keep short of fuse and finding things.
Yeah. Yeah,
Nobody can use them or leave the street.
yeah,
Recycle.
yeah, I agree with you. All right, well, anything else? Any other questions?
Yeah.
Have a great, few weeks.
When people ask me, I only got one.